We're back to Gary Paulson's book, Tucket's Home. This is the fifth volume in the series, the last one. So here we go. We're at chapter 10. Francis could not believe the river. He stood with Lottie at his right and Billy at his left, Orson and the men off to the side, and stared at the river in awe and not a little fear. It was half a mile across, smooth with a fast current that made the dark waters roil so that they looked almost alive and evil. The Columbia. They had come across the last of the high desert plains with little further mishap and no injuries. Now, following a trail that was so heavily traveled, it would have been impossible to get lost. They set the wagon wheels in the ruts. Game became more and more scarce, and Billy and Francis ranged farther and farther afield to get meat, at times going 10 or 15 miles off the track before they found a deer or elk. Buffalo had disappeared completely, hunted out in the years the wagons had been passing, as had most other game. But as they came near the river, they met Indians of different bands and tribes who wanted to barter tools or steel or guns for food. The men and Francis had nothing extra to trade, but Francis, who knew the more or less universal sign language used by all the tribes to trade or talk war or peace, took some young men aside and they showed him how to catch salmon in the river, using line and bone hooks. Francis set to fishing as soon as they reached the river. The salmon were so numerous that they seemed to fill the water, and soon he had more than enough fish for everybody. The meat was oily and thick and rich, and while it tasted fine at first, within 2 days Francis was ready for elk or venison again. Work on rafts began at once. The wagons were broken down and taken apart. Huge cedar logs were cut from the surrounding forest, and horses and harness were used to skid them down to the water. They lashed the logs together with rope and bark twine and used boards from the wagons to make flooring. Then they built a pen to hold the animals. But now the Indians, at first helpful, had changed. When it became apparent that the white men had nothing further to trade or sell, the Indians took to stealing. Any tool left lying around, a nail, a piece of rope, an auger bit, was soon gone. They hung around the camp constantly, watching the men work and waiting for a chance to grab something and run. The white men soon learned to keep track of their tools and equipment and stopped losing gear, but they began to distrust the Indians. While fishing one day, Francis befriended a young man named Icta. Icta's language was almost impossible for Francis to learn because there were so many short, guttural, sharply cut off phrases that were hard to pronounce, but they soon became almost fluid in their sign language, and Francis learned to trust Icta. They were sitting on the bank one day, just after Francis had said his lines, watching the dark waters stream past, when Icta pointed down the river and sighed, "The water down there is not safe." Francis sighed, "Why?" He watched Icta carefully as he answered, has been a dry year, no rain, very little snow. The river will not come high as it does sometimes. It is too low. There are places where many rocks stick out of the water like sharp teeth. They eat the boats and the men and the horses and the oxen. Is this all true? Yes. What must be done? There is a trail back through the mountains. It will take more time, but it is safe. My people could help you carry your goods and drive your animals. Do not let the men go on that river. That night, while eating salmon, always salmon, Francis told Orson what Icta had said. "We've not heard of this before," Orson said. "Nobody in any group has left word. He says we are the first this year to try the river." Orson shook his head. "We would have heard. And now this man says his people will help us carry our things over the mountains? The same people who would steal us blind?" "He says the river is too dangerous," Francis repeated. "Farther down, miles down into the canyons, where you cannot turn around. He says there are rocks that will tear the rafts to pieces. You cannot go through." Orson sighed. He was not tired. Francis did not think he could ever be tired, but there was a sadness in his voice. "I think that we cannot believe what you have heard about the river. I think they merely want to steal more from us and are using this as a way to get what you want." "Orson, I believe him. I'm going to go around." Orson shook his head. "You've learned how to make your own way, and you must do what you think is right. We wish you well." Francis knelt in the dirt and took a stick to sketch a map, and he thought of Grimes as he drew. How many times the mountain man had done the same thing, showing a river, a tree, mountains drawn in the dirt, as Francis did it now. "Here we are," he said. Icta said it would take 7 days by horse to get back to the river below the bad places. "Lottie, Billy, and I will leave tomorrow with horses, and you won't be leaving for another week at least. We'll stop here, near where Ikta says there are two peaks, and camp by the river and wait. If you're right, when you come along, we'll join you. And if we're wrong, Orson looked steadily at Francis. Francis shook his head. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. They shook hands, and Francis went to tell Lottie and Billy to get ready. That night they packed and arranged the loads. They left at dawn, and Francis did not look at the river as they rode away. He thought only of shaking hands with Orson. Ooh. Now here's chapter 11. I don't think they're coming, Lottie said. They decided to stay right where they were. Her eyes were hopeful as she poked the fire. Or maybe, Billy said, they haven't left yet. Maybe, Francis nodded. Yes, that's probably it. They haven't left yet. But Francis didn't believe it. Orson and the other men might have delayed a day or two, but it was going on 2 weeks since Francis and Lottie and Billy had set out. Once they reached the river, Ikta had left them here to camp and gone back to scout. The men should have come along by now. The three of them had been waiting for more than 8 days. Billy had ranged out to hunt. Somehow he had brought down an elk with his small bow. It was a large bull, more than 700 pounds, and they had spent the week in a comfortable camp by the river, drying elk meat and eating red meat to get the taste of salmon out of their mouths. Should we stop looking? Lottie asked. No, Francis shook his head. They had been taking turns watching the river and standing watch by the fire at night to keep it going so the men could see it. Let's keep it up for a while yet. Maybe I should look for another elk, Billy pointed at the hills. I saw fresh signs back by about 4 miles. We could use the meat when they come. Good idea. The way they eat, we'll need... Francis trailed off. It was late afternoon, and he was watching the river while he spoke. The water was more than a half-mile wide here, but had flattened considerably and slowed down. The river was still dark and had what must have been underwater obstacles because it seemed to boil and tumble almost in an oily way, with thick bulges that rolled up and back under. While he watched, Francis saw the body of a man hit one of the bulges, come upright for a second with his arms up in the air, almost as if waving, and then disappear. He was too far away to tell for certain, but it looked like a lot like Orson. Francis nearly cried out. While he watched, he saw the bodies of 4 horses and 1 ox float through the same eddy. Then came a large piece of wreckage that was unmistakably part of the raft Orson and the men had made from their wagons and cedar logs. He dropped to his knees, mutely watching the water. Then there was nothing. Lottie and Billy had been looking away and had not seen anything, but Francis felt a brush on his shoulder and turned to see Ikta standing there making signs. The teeth of the river have taken your friends. Francis nodded slowly and answered with shaking hands. I'm afraid that is so. What did he say? Lottie asked. He said that Orson and the rest of them aren't coming. Well, we can't wait. I like traveling with them, even when I have to cook. No. Francis put his hand on her shoulder. They aren't coming. Ever. Oh, her eyes grew wide, then teared. Oh, all of them? He nodded. Oh, Francis. She turned and looked at the river across it, at the mountains behind. Is it to be like this always? Just always so hard, so that it crushes people? He covered her face. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Billy had been listening silently, standing on one leg with his left foot on the inside of his right knee, and he nodded now, looking strangely weary and wise beyond his years. He looked up and down the river. It's always been hard. I guess it always will be hard. He went up to Lottie and put his hand on her shoulder. Francis felt less grief than a bone tiredness. He had used up all his grief when Grimes was killed. Now he was so exhausted that even pain was dulled. He just wanted it over. We can't travel on the river, he said to Ikta. Even if we had time and could do it, making the rafts would take more tools than we carry. He looked back into the mountains. Is there a trail that will take us to what the white men call the Golden Valley, where the settlements begin? Ikta frowned, thinking. There's a talk of such a trail. It follows the river, but way off to the side. I have not seen it and do not wish to go to where the white men live, but they say it is easy to follow. Just look for the dead line with the yellow flowers. Dead line? There's no grass because the animals of the white men have eaten it all. And where the animals leave their sign in the flat places, there are yellow flowers that grow tall and smell bad. Francis had been speaking aloud, translating to Lottie and Billy as he read sign, and Lottie said with her face still wet with tears, He means mustard, Francis. Papa showed us how the wild mustard seed is in some of the feed the wagon trains carry. The oxen and horses eat it, and it passes through them and grows where they leave their manure while they walk. We just have to follow the mustard flowers. How far is it? Francis asked. How many sleeps? Victor shrugged. Some say 3, others 7 or 8. It depends on how you work your horses. Close, Francis thought. I am close to done with this. We are close to done with this. I thank you for the time spent traveling with us. Victor shrugged again. It was right to do it. Sitting by the fire with you to talk was a good time. Some things are not a good time, but this was. I will go now. And he turned his pony and disappeared, and Francis waved a hand in farewell. Then he looked at the sun. We can make some miles before dark. You want to keep going? Billy was already gathering his things together. Lottie nodded. I want to get away from this cursed river. They broke camp quickly. Billy rode first, then Lottie, who trailed the pack horse. Francis mounted and followed them. There had been times when his life depended on water, times when he would have loved to see this river, but now he wanted shut of it. He wanted shut of it. He never wanted to see it again. Wow. That was chapter 11. Chapter 10 and 11. There you go. We'll be back for more next time. Until then, bye.